Hello, my name is Harris Gleckman. I'm with the Center for Governance and Sustainability with the University of Massachusetts in Boston. I have actually two observations I'd like to share with the panel and to hear the reactions. One is about the concept of horizontal governance. I would welcome understanding what you mean by it and how asymmetries of power between the participants in what you describe as horizontal governments are addressed. It seems as a political scientist, I didn't hear very much about the power issues as to whether the combination of the actors have some degree or possibly have some degree of equivalent status either in political leverage, economic leverage, effectiveness, institutional ways in which the asymmetries of power of the participants are addressed. The second part of that question has to do with a word that is a bit scarce, is democracy. How do the process of selecting the participants in these various arrangements get done that have some new concept of democracy, or are we functionally tossing it aside, to be honest about it? And if we are, let's be clear that that's what's going on. My second observation is about the word and the concept of partnership. We had lunch at the School of Management. When businesses strike partnerships between businesses, they draft very detailed understandings about how to get into it, who's going to do what, who's putting in capital, who will take risks, how it shuts down. And these partnership agreements form a hard basis of what the expectations and obligations are of all the actors. We also use the word partnership in a social sense. Two people form a partnership. And I'm afraid that what we're doing in the political dialogue is we are picking up this word without having a concrete understanding of what it means. It means neither, but catch the sense of a romantic, long-term personal commitments, nor does it have the clarity of a commercial partnership. So my appeal is in academic discussions is that we drop the word altogether. For those who'd like to take a different view, I'd love to understand precisely what is meant by partnership as a scholarly term.
Well, thanks a lot. I forgot to say something before. Harry's really wonderful questions. But just for the sake to give the opportunity to everyone to intervene, let's make sure that each one of those who want to ask questions makes one question, that questions are actually shorter than the presentations, and to make sure that they all end up with a question mark. So I think Professor Rubia.
Well, I notice, I will address myself to Mrs. Andronova in particular, if you don't mind me saying that. You are talking about creating a sort of international structure, which is supposed to be intergovernmental, which is supposed to take care of environment, compare economics aspects, of society aspects, and so forth and so on. I thought we have an agency of this type. It's called the International Energy Agency, which lives in Paris, about 200 kilometers away from here. Can you explain me what is the difference between the agency you propose to create and eventually what modifications do we have to do in order to make the International Energy Agency to work according to the lines you're proposing? We cannot invent new things when you have old one. Then I have a second sub-question of the first. He had three, I only have two, which is as follows. You are discussing about the third example, you gave an example of Switzerland. Do you think if Switzerland, in which you live, should be willing to accept the idea that the decision about the energetic future 2012-2050 for Switzerland should not be done by the Swiss with their system, democratic system, whatever you want, but it should be decided by an international body outside Switzerland itself?
Thank you very much. My question is also to Professor Andonova, and it's about the role of local governments in all this new architecture. I think many people understand that there is a shift in power and decision-making from the national capitals to the cities itself. But how to really make this a reality in this scheme that you mentioned, and congratulations on that graph that details the other actors that were not taken into consideration before in the MDGs. I do hope that each one of them are really active players in the SDGs negotiation process. But going to the point, I continue to ask that question myself. I have heard so many times that the 21st century is the century of the cities, where city-to-city diplomacy, multilateral engagement, and so on is going to be so active. I don't see that, and perhaps I'm being a little pessimistic, but it would be very interesting for me to listen from you, from this perspective that you have shared, which is, in my opinion, really out of the box, and I congratulate you. But how do you see this power sharing between the ministries specifically and the municipalities and the regions and the prefectures and governorates and so on, not only on the environmental side, but in general? Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Alex.
Thanks.
Perhaps we can give the floor to the three panelists and who feels like speaking first, if you have something to say. In order, don't know, Frank, Liliana?
I can
Liliana?
start. I will take the questions in turn and make comments, and then perhaps others in the panel can contribute. Asymmetries of power in horizontal governance, as if there is no asymmetries in power in vertical governance. So first of all, I just want to clarify that asymmetries of power are always an aspect of international and domestic politics. And that's why access to politics and some level of transparency and accountability, in my humble opinion, is the only way to kind of mitigate asymmetries of power which exist equally in hierarchical as well as transnational governance. And the question of democracy, that's why I deliberately included Switzerland in my sample of cases, because in the Swiss case, you have a major shift towards a cleaner energy path, which is essentially driven by the idea of very localized, very decentralized democracy. And I draw here on the research of some of my students, the shift in political party position in the center, away from nuclear and towards a climate constraint consideration, came out of the realization that even if you want to build new nuclear power station in Switzerland, because of the roles of referendum and local democracy, it will be very, very difficult to get permissions. So it was, in some sense, pointless to hold on to that particular energy path, and the government had to rethink how to combine the objectives of access or security and carbon constraint. And this is still a proposal that the government has. It is adopted at the government level, but it will go through multiple debates. And the same thing with the Galapagos example. There, in fact, I think it's a horizontal partnership, and certainly in terms of raw power, the electricity consortium, E8, it's a consortium of some of the major energy companies, but they're in some ways the guests to that partnerships. They were brought in by UNDP, which was supporting the initiative of a mayor, essentially, in the Galapagos. So I think these are very important questions, and one answer is not the kind of putting the democratic process under the table, but considering what new means we have to assure accountability, transparency, and democracies at different levels of governance, instead of to pretend that only in a government setting you have some degree of accountability. The question of what's wrong with the International Energy Agency? First of all, I'm not advocating for new international agencies. Frank is advocating for new international agencies, and I'm sure he will take up this question. But what I was advocating is for the existing international agencies and the Sustainable Development Goals to be better equipped to look also to upscale successful technological or governance experiments at a larger level. You don't know what upscale? I don't understand what you're saying. Can you repeat? Well, yes, I'll try. So what I'm arguing that, so if the International Energy Agency is to be an important player, one of the criticisms of the International Energy Agency has been that it is too focused on supply and too focused on fossil fuels. And that's why some governments created IRENA. That's a whole other discussion. Do we need a specific agency for renewable energy? IRENA, yes. But that was but my point about upscaling, and it goes back to the question that was asked on the role of cities and local governments, is does the multilateral system have the means, the financial means and institutional means, to reward and to replicate successful governance and technological experiments at the local level? In other words, if we are to increase access to electricity in Africa, it seems to me that there are multiple ways to do that without large grids. And there are multiple communities who have successfully entrepreneured access to energy at the local level. But the international system currently is not equipped to take these small-scale initiatives and make them larger and more distributed. And one way to do that, if, for example, if we take the cities, there are several movements of cities for climate change that claim to be moving towards more carbon-intensive trajectory, employing new energy efficiency technology, streamlining traffic, and so on and so forth. We know these movements exist. We know these commitments exist at the city level. We have no idea where they're effective, and we have no idea if they're effective, those that are effective, how can they be upscaled. So it seems to me that it is reasonable to have programs such as the World Bank and UN Habitat attempted to actually create a system that accounts for the emission reductions at the city level by voluntary initiatives, and to figure out a way to upscale some of these voluntary initiatives in local governance. But we do not have currently systematic or well-endowed instruments at the international level to really work with local communities to such extent to make a substantial difference in upscaling some of the most interesting experiments. And I think that responds to some extent to your question. So, for example, under the UNFCCC, it will be very important to have some accountability mechanism for these horizontal initiatives, to see whether they're producing something or not, and for the ones that are producing something to be rewarded and to be replicated more broadly. And it is a little utopian, but I think that is the reality of a very integrated world. And if the other way is markets, but we are political scientists. We're interested in institutions and how institutions can be used to provide the right signals for innovation to diffuse.
Yeah, and markets are also institutions. Thanks a lot, Liliana.
That is an eternal debate. I'm on the other side of it.
Frank and Peter, maybe 2 minutes each, so that we can go for another round of questions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is also, you don't like Irena either. But it seems to me that if those things don't work, you should change them and make them work according to the rules, rather than inventing new systems. Finished. That was my comment.
Yes, I like IRENA and like the International Energy Agency. We just need a little bit of change for them to support more diffusion. To support not only intergovernmental agreement, but diffusion of good practices.
Yeah. Tomorrow, Sylvia Carson will make a whole presentation about this. She's probably the greatest world expert on these issues of global energy governance. So we're very much looking forward to that. Frank or Peter?
Very, very interesting points. Can you hear me? Good. Good. Well, starting with partnerships. This is fully correct. Normally in academic papers we don't use the term, because the term comes from politics, it comes from political community, and it doesn't mean much. And the success of the term partnership, has to do with the fact that all kind of actors have a different understanding. That's the same as freedom, democracy, all these kind of terms. Everybody has a different understanding. This makes it quite easy to work together on a partnership. So therefore, like in political terms, political science terms, we normally use terms like networks, for example, transnational networks of public policy actors or so. And I think, the way, the term partnership has developed, because it comes to some extent also from the business community, is leading to a certain neoliberal understanding of the world, in a sense that might lead to a certain policy capture of policy processes by industry and by those profit-seeking corporations that have, as we discussed this morning, maybe also the interest of the planet in mind, but also the profit interest. So I think I can recommend you a very good book from a PhD student of mine, Aisha Mert. She has written a discourse analysis of the emergence of the word partnership in the last 200 years. It was very interesting. Where she kind of really pointed this out, how this term came from various different sources and then all flowing together into Rio 92 and then Johannesburg 2002. It's a very interesting study to see also how different actors have pushed for this term, used this term, and kind of all put it into their own meaning, their own way of thinking about, and then bringing in their own interest. And I think this high-level panel is the last step in this process by which partnerships are being kind of elevated to the global religion that we all have to follow, and it is in the interest of certain people. Coming to democracy, this is of course a great, I think this is one of the biggest challenges for political scientists, is to reinvent democracy in the 21st century on a variety of issues. Talking about the national level, it's a question of representation of future generations. That's number one. And the second is the question how you can organize a democratic system that protects long-term interest. And this has been done, for example, like currency and trade. These are certain issues which have been taken out of the democratic process in a way, because they're regulated by the central banks. The interpretation of the constitution has been taken out, has been regulated by courts. So in a way, there are some actors who kind of propose that also certain long-term interest should be in some form being taken out of the election cycles, not out of the democratic process, but out of the election cycle, the same way in which we have taken currencies, constitutional interpretation, and also trade agreements somewhat out of the every 4 years we have an election and we have to prepare for the next one. At the global level, I think there is a tremendous amount of research needed to better understand what global democracy can mean. There are, of course, lots of cosmopolitan scholars, for example, David Held. There are many people who have worked on this, but I think much more is needed. And I'm personally, if I read these three things, I think I mentioned in my presentation. A World Parliamentarian Assembly is number one. Number two is a civil society forum. And number three is a deliberative forum of citizens selected on a random basis, John Rice's proposal. And these are three proposals, really concrete ones, how you can kind of add more representative elements to the UN system. And I have no preference for either one. I think this was very interesting. They've not very developed so far, all these proposals. They're all there, kind of some papers. The World Parliamentarian Assembly idea seems to me being currently the winner in terms of support by European politicians, and it's only the Europeans in a way, but many European Green parties, socialists, social democratic parties, they all seem to support now this idea of having a parliamentarian assembly in the UN system, which raises, of course, lots of questions. What parliaments and how many votes per country and whatever. But I think this is very important to study this more. But energy, I just want to pick this up. The IEA thing, of course I proposed in the organization because the system is totally messed up, the energy governance system at the global level, because we have the IEA that doesn't cover all countries and has a certain preference maybe for fossils. Then we have ARENA, which was proposed by some countries originally, but interestingly is now kind of a global organization. That's a very fascinating success story that... How do you know it's a success story? Well, no. I don't say effectiveness because it's too early to talk about effectiveness. But I talk about institutional creation. Because this is a process where some countries have just set up an example, tried to set a minilateral institution. It's very unusual. It was outside the normal process. It was just a couple of countries getting together, and then it has now been ratified by all countries. And this is a very new way of setting up international institutions. I mean, how it is effective, we have to see. They have to start working, of course. But this is what they have. And then they have the Nuclear Energy Agency. So we have, in a way, we have organized energy policy in a way which is according to the sources and not to the services. So kind of we have one for nuclear, one for renewable, and then we have the IEA. And this is something I think is not a very effective way, but we discuss this tomorrow maybe with Sylvia when she presents about it. And for cities, I mean, cities I find fascinating. I mean, we have now 50% of human population living in cities. It will be up to 70% pretty soon. So in a sense, the human species is an urban species. We all live in cities. And there are two things that I think worth mentioning. The one is, I think you hinted at this, cities as a global actor in politics. And this, I think there's this kind of lots of these C40 different networks of cities where the idea is that mayors are just sitting together, agree on certain standards, agree on certain policies or best practices, and then we don't need the entire intergovernmental process anymore. You don't need the climate convention anymore if just the big cities strike a deal. And this is a fascinating idea. I think it doesn't work. I mean, there have been some research has been done about this. There was a larger group at Oxford at one point that studied all these different agreements of cities, how cities work together. And it's not really clear to me that this has proven to be an effective governance mechanism at the global level. But it's an interesting hypothesis, and it's interesting to pursue this further. But I think the big question is really, I mean, the solution to the Anthropocene lies in the cities. I think that's very important. And just yesterday I was at the other conference where there are interesting presentations about that cities have to go from linear to circular. Now we have linear. We put resources into the city and we put waste out. It's kind of like that goes through. And we have to find ways that the cities are kind of generating the stuff in a circular way and reusing everything. I think it's a big challenge. There are lots of technologies out there, lots of interesting ideas, but I think if cities can really manage to reinvent themselves, then we have a huge step forward. So I think, I mean, all the mayor, communal politicians, local authorities, I think this is one of the big keys to success if they take up the challenge. And they do. But I mean, more is needed, of course, and we have to make progress.
Well, thanks a lot. Peter?
I want to make a minor response to Harris's question about the creative ambiguity of language. And there's simply a trade-off between the political use of language and the effectiveness of its use. That, partnerships certainly make it easier to get groups together if they're being ambiguous about the nature of the relationship. On the other hand, it makes it much harder to assess the effectiveness of what they're doing. And I'm afraid that the word sustainability is moving in exactly the same direction. That everybody wants to say that what they're doing is sustainable. On the other hand, it becomes much more difficult to assess the effectiveness of those sustainable activities, which is, you can use universal search and replace for creating sustainable development goals, replacing anything you want with sustainability, but they're not going to work.
If I could just say one word on partnerships, because the stakes are high. I just wanted to say something about in the line of creative ambiguity. Again, when the concept of international regimes was kind of launched in the 70s, 80s, Oren Young, Peter, and others, there was there was a lot of ambiguity, a lot of critical thought about it, and critical thought is a wonderful thing for making a concept work. Now we are in the era of partnerships, and we can't avoid that. I have worked on that a lot, and with Frank we have exchanged ideas and work. And I have tried to use other terms, but they're not truth to the concept. And partnership is a term that can be defined very relatively clearly. It's an agreement between multiple actors on a set of objectives and goals and procedures to achieve them. And at the same time, it's a phenomenon that is hugely diverse. But there are many phenomena that are not perfectly declined. There is some concept stretching and that they're diverse, and that does not prevent us from naming them. So you either see the word partnerships as a new liberal conspiracy, against which I have nothing to argue, or you see them as another term that denotes an important development in global governance, and you study it as such. Certainly, it is impossible to study global health without taking care of partnerships. A lot of the achievements in global health, not all of them, but some of the achievements in global health are done in the last 15 years as a consequence of the ability for multiple actors to partner across borders, across sectors. And this is a very important development in global governance, and we can't just ignore it because the term could mean many things and could have neoliberal connotations as well.
Well, thanks a lot, Liliana. So we have 2 minutes before coffee break, and I see that Arthur conveniently has the microphone. I think it perfectly makes sense to give him the floor, and I'm sure everyone agrees, given also you were supposed to speak this afternoon, and you've been kind enough to accept to speak tomorrow morning. So Arthur, then coffee break.
Well, a simple question to these brilliant political scientists all gathered together. You know, having seen for 40 years the conservatism of diplomats, ministers of foreign affairs, and the immobilism of the system of national sovereignty, all these new ideas for transformation and governance, how do we bridge the two? What can we do with this system that is frozen in place to get it to move in the direction of the changes we all are saying are needed? Do you have any suggestions or ideas for practical ways forward?
Yeah, that's
Well, apart from short of revolution, which is the only thing that's worked in the past, are there any other ways, you know, to bring a change in these systems that are stuck at the present time? Thank you.
There was another question over
well,
there.
I mean, okay.
There was
I've got an answer to that
yeah.
one.
Is that we're running a little bit short in time. Yeah, so what I propose is that we take up this challenge and discuss over coffee. That perhaps...
Peter has a 2-second answer.
2 seconds?
Yeah.
Okay.
A good crisis.
But we already had one in
Which one?
2008.
Which one?
2008.
Oh, the financial crisis.
Financial crisis. You need a bigger one.
You need a...
Bigger one.
So big crisis.
Well, that's the problem. It's, I mean, it's,
So I guess
yeah.
Alex and Thomas will take over the challenge.
you know, Fukushima sort of did that for nuclear.
Maybe we should have taken that question.
Yeah, go on.
and we
There's
can
still
discuss
time for
it.
one more.
Okay, thank you. Rescaling, Liliana agreed. But Frank then, sorry, Pierre Foncel from this university. About qualified majority voting, that famous thing, you have it in at the Monetary Fund, International Monetary Fund, where you have money and so forth. But is that really an option? And especially what happened now with France, defending their cultural exception, and just to put their foot down, and, you know, in spite of the kind of majority of the rest of European countries, they got their will in this enormous important discussions with America. And then the question to Peter is, you know, you gave those individual cases of discussing of food security, energy security, and sustainable energy. But if you put them together, those individual things, you might have conflicting interests, and you know, you won't get a global solution.
Yes. I mean,
Okay, so now we have a trade-off. Either we get answers, well, things that could look like answers, or cold coffee. Maybe answers, like 2 minutes each. No? Frank?
Financial indicators. I mean, IMF means, I mean, the rich people, the rich countries, which means the rich people of the planet, the 20% of those who are kind of wasting 72% of the resources, they have to say. So this kind of mechanism you can't transfer to any other global governance mechanism because it's just not fair. If you mean this, I mean, so the $1 one vote mechanism is certainly nothing you should use outside the World Bank and IMF, and I think you should not even use it there. So, but the other point I think is a very interesting. I think the first point is I think I'm more optimistic actually, because I think one thing we discussed this morning, a generation in a way, that I think the younger, the third secretaries in the embassies or the fourth ones, the younger ones, I think what I hear and hear from them is changing. They're really kind of thinking out of the box and they say, hey, the 1970s are over. Let's do it differently now. No? And this is kind of, I mean, the young ones from Costa Rica, Guatemala, I mean, these people who have kind of taken initiatives on the SDGs, for example, I think they are kind of really moving forward in a speed and in a way that is unknown from those who have been socialized in the new international economic order in 1973 and 4. So I think this is kind of a change that is happening, but the answer from an institutional perspective is to bring in other people than only foreign office people. I think that's kind of the argument for bringing in NGOs in national delegations and bringing in civil society, citizens, parliamentarians, whatever, in the formal decision processes at the UN level or other intergovernmental processes. So I think this is kind of the institutional answer, but the other answer is also that I think there's a lot of movement, a lot of people who say that they want to smash some eggs to get the omelet. So good.
Well, now, in response to that institutional design question, I can think of several points. One is you don't have to have the same voting rules on every sort of decision. Secondly, in addition to what Frank was saying about expanding the constituency of the organization, what you also need is to get development and finance people in on environment decisions. The third is to have meetings outside of New York. The quickest way to get movement is to not have discussions where the dominant discourse is still the 1970s. And then the last is in terms of institutional design, that if you have a multi-cameral institution in which you have some configuration of civil society, the private sector, and scientists operating in parallel with what the governments are doing. The governments can vote any way they want. There's much more transparency about what's being done. So if they do something that's undesirable, they're going to get grief in sort of an indirect link. And I mean, there are a number of models of how to do that. ILO, IUCN, the old UN Center on Transnational Corporations had standing observers that represented these different communities of non-state actors. So, you have a parliamentary panel as well, and they can talk themselves to death while the governments are talking themselves to death. But I mean, there are a lot of different bicameral structures that would address that problem of state accountability without directly going to, that shibboleth of international relations, of national sovereignty.
I mean, my follows on Peter's suggestion, and it's subsidiarity. If the sustainability governance tries to follow a little bit the human rights governance in terms of if governments are at least capable to adopt a set of norms and be willing to delegate then greater responsibility to various bodies, as Peter mentioned, then there is more opportunities for actions at different levels. So even if at the top level it's blocked, then you could have partnerships for energy, or you could have a periodic review of country performance by scientists, periodic review by NGOs, a little utopian on my part, but nonetheless some level of subsidiarity in institutions and more prominent role of science, more prominent role of external evaluations by civil society may move the boat a little bit further.
Well, good. Thanks a lot.